Hello, everyone. Hello. So this panel is more about where the money is, and joined here by some esteemed colleagues who have numerous backgrounds: entrepreneurs, investors, teachers, bankers, and also not-for-profits. Really looking to make this more about connectivity and awareness when it comes to capital raising. Usually the biggest challenge with any entrepreneurial startup or any business is access to capital. I'll speak from my background. We're a private equity firm. We've been in business for about 9 years. We do not have institutional funding. Our funding comes from family offices as well as athletes and entertainers. Our IRRs have been in the range of 30%. We've returned investments in a matter of 3x. We qualify as top 10 percentile on our investments, and we continue to have issues on access to capital. Our family offices come from international investors, so domestically we continue to have issues on access to capital. And I'm quite sure the panel will agree. The goal here is really to have key steps on how to navigate through the opportunities of finding the people that can invest in your company. So with that, I will start with the panel, and they can do a quick introduction of yourself for about 2 minutes, and then we'll get into some questions that I'll have for them.
Corey, thank you very much. My name is Niles Stewart. I'm with Carver Federal Savings Bank, based up here right here in Harlem. Bank's been around for 65 years and actually was started to provide access to capital in the communities where we couldn't get funding from traditional banks. I've been with the bank about 2 years and run their business banking division and business lending, and we're becoming very aggressive. Carver traditionally wasn't in that business, but we're becoming very aggressive in that business because we see that there's a gap in our community for folks to get access to capital. So I'm here as a banker. Small business lending, middle market lending is what I'm going to talk about, and what banks look for when folks are trying to get capital. And very excited about this entire project.
I'm Ray Garcia from Boring Capital. Been running Boring Capital since early 2000, and focused on, I have a broader notion of capital, so it includes people, technology, IP, of course funding, and access to new markets.
Morning, my name is this work? Thank you. My name is Barbara Chang, and I am the CEO of a new nonprofit in New York. It's called Code to Work. And what I am attempting to do, I'm a sort of a bootstrap nonprofit, but just in terms of my background, I've run a couple of nonprofits in the past. I started a nonprofit back in 2001 called NPower. It was financed primarily by Microsoft, and when I launched NPower, we had about $1 million in the bank to get started. Code to Work is completely different. We are bootstrapping. We are the notion of Code to Work is to create a formal runway for minorities and women to access technology jobs at large companies. And the premise being that many large companies, when they're talking about technology jobs, they oftentimes recruit from a very, very short list of elite tech colleges. And what I'm trying to get them to see in terms of helping to diversify their technical staff is that there is a whole pool of talent that nobody's looking at. And if you go to sort of non-traditional or sort of off the elite list, there is there's tremendous talent, and we're helping to identify that with some of the large companies that we're working with. So.
Hi, my name is Rick Willard. I'm a serial entrepreneur. Started out in the digital space pretty much my entire career. Advertising, marketing, consumer engagement. Had a .com in the 90s, divested, started putting up screens in Times Square and other places as a consultant to large brands, and presently have a cryptocurrency or a digital currency incubator and think tank and product lab downtown Manhattan. But I am a son of Harlem, and I have lived here intermittently for most of my life. Now we are in the Flatiron District, and we create different digital economic ecosystems for large brands and for nonprofits.
So we've talked about the most impactful way to address the audience and have something that you guys can take away with as some nuggets and help you in your goals of raising capital. And I'll start with Ray. How do you know that a startup is ready for an investment?
Okay. So there's a couple of clear sort of markers I can speak from my own sort of direct experience in the past of starting several companies, which ended up being venture backed. But the reality is that the only companies that I've ever made any money from were actually bootstrapped. And so the first investment I kind of looked for was the investment, not technically investment, but the endorsement from the market and the customers. And also, yeah, can you hear me? No. Yeah, I thought,
Is it on?
Just put it
Is this on?
Ray.
was that,
He's gotta
just
bring
put
it
it closer? Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Okay, all right. Maybe I'll take it off here. It's not working. Yeah, so the first investment that I look for is endorsement from the marketplace. Of course, you have to put up your own capital. If you can't invest in your own business, other people are not going to be attracted to your business. And frankly, the only I've had 4 companies that were venture backed, and the only company I ever made money from was the one that was bootstrapped from the beginning. The others, some were flat, didn't do so well. So, for me, the mark of going out to raise capital from venture capitalists is best done when you don't need it. Unfortunately, that's the answer most people don't want to hear. You can speak for bank lending. If you don't need the money, then your chances of raising it is much greater. Now, that being said, there are some businesses which are capital intensive. If it's your first business, I would tend to stay away from those. There are a lot of businesses you can do that don't need a lot of capital. You can get started, bootstrapping yourself. It takes a long time. Frankly, I always wanted to be an entrepreneur as a kid. I didn't become an entrepreneur until I worked in industry for 10 years and saved my money. And I was able to, take the plunge and survive for at least a year with this, scary threat of running out of money and ending up where I started, right? That's...
And I, just from my personal experience, I know that investing in yourself is the most important part. And, having the opportunity to go on that entrepreneurial path out of corporate America, which I think a lot of us do, is a lot of risk and a lot of nervousness because culturally we're not used to not having that steady paycheck. So it's, very appreciative when you take that leap and you continue to grow that business. So to back onto that, I'll go to Niles. And so my question to you is, when is the right time to go to a bank for debt financing, which is slightly different than, way different than venture or private equity because the banks don't take risks. They're not equity, they're debt. And, there's guarantees, personal guarantees, which you can talk to, and things like that are a little more detailed and puts your personal life out there more than that.
Absolutely, Corey. First, I'm going to mirror what Ray said is, unfortunately, the easiest time to get a loan at the bank is when you don't need one. A business that's profitable, that's showing years of sustained profit and has a good balance sheet, good assets, could typically get a loan anywhere they want. But unfortunately, they're not the ones that require the access to capital. So, when you come to a bank, typically you've either bootstrapped your business to the point where you put your own equity in, you've borrowed from family members, you've taken out a loan against your house to start up a business, and then now you're gaining some critical momentum where your business is doing okay, and you need to go to that next step. Maybe you've got a contract with some government or private company, and they're not going to pay you for 90 days, but you've got to keep the lights on, so you need to get a line of credit. So bank lending is very different. All banks, be they small community banks like Carver, or larger money center banks like Citi and Bank of America, kind of look at the same few things when you come into a bank. And they talk about the 5 C's of credit, but the real 3 are your capacity to pay back. Do you have cash flow? your character, what's your credit look like, and capital. Corey said you have to invest in your own business. If you haven't significantly invested in your own business, then most banks will not follow you. And the best time is, we are for a more mature company. You need to have a couple years of operation before you start talking to a bank about financing.
Yep. And at least what I learned from working with banks is from an entrepreneur seat and from someone that finances or invests in different companies, we try to leverage the banks to our benefit as opposed to the banks leveraging us. So we understand the relationship there, and what we try to do is say, all right, we want to grow our business, but we want to make sure that we don't want to give away a lot of equity. We want to use interest payments instead of raising more capital, which actually keeps us whole and increases your profits for the shareholder. Now, these are all obviously for-profit industries. So I'll go to Barbara on the next one, who works on the not-for-profit side. And I'll ask, how does raising money in the not-for-profit sector differ from the for-profit sector?
Okay, can you guys hear me? I actually fed Corey that question because just to be completely transparent here. A couple of things. One is, I don't know, how many of you guys watch Shark Tank? I'm like a total geek about Shark Tank. I think about Shark Tank in the nonprofit. There's no Shark Tank in the nonprofit sector, but you do go in front of foundation grant managers and try to pitch your idea in a similar way. And you don't get eaten alive the way they do on Shark Tank, but they do definitely kind of look to see whether or not you've got a couple of things. And I think some of them are similar to what the sharks are looking for in an investment when they're looking for at an entrepreneur. But some of them are very different. So first of all, they're not looking for a return on their investment in the sort of pure capital, for-profit way. So cash, how much money, your business plan, while it's getting more and more rigorous from the foundation perspective, they're not looking to make money from their investments. So that's sort of one of those things that I think is really important in the nonprofit sector. Differently, though, what they're looking for is what problem are you solving, and how are you solving that problem? What is the problem that you've identified, and does it resonate for them in terms of the way in which they make their grants, in terms of the grant making guidelines that they have for their foundation? And as I said earlier, I'm bootstrapping Code to Work. So what I mean by that is, when I first got started, my first grant was a $10,000 grant from a hedge fund. I met the grant manager at a dinner. So there was no formal, I had no idea. I was going to one of these sort of like group dinners, and I met her, started talking to her about what I was doing, and then she got really excited. And I think it goes to the second part of what I was going to say about what foundation grant managers are looking for, which is passion from the entrepreneur, from the person who's starting it up. So if you're talking about your mission, and you're talking, and even in the for-profit sector, I think this is really important, and you don't have a lot of sort of energy around what you're talking about, I think your investor, your foundation grant manager in the nonprofit side will see that. And that's it's a flag for them, because they want to see that you are sleeping, eating, drinking your passion. And if for any reason they don't see a little bit of that, they're going to back up a little bit. So for the nonprofit sector, looking at what your problem is that you're solving, having some passion, and then really, sort of working on a bootstrap budget, which I think once we got started, we got foundations that started to look at what we were doing. And, unlike my experience at NPower, where, you started off with $1 million in the bank, it was kind of easy. For me at Code to Work, it's really more about how can you be as efficient as you can be with the dollars that you have to actually start to get something done. Because if you don't get anything done, there's nothing to show, and then the foundations sort of back up and they don't really want to make the investment. And foundations tend to be quite lemming-like in that once the ball starts rolling, a lot of foundations start looking at you at the same time. So it's not, the first one in is the hardest one, because they're the one that you've got to convince to take a chance. And if you can't get that first one in, then you've got a big sort of steep hill to climb.
Okay. I've seen a lot of that with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Their measurables now are very similar to a for-profit measurable. It's just that how many people are you impacting, right? So is your penetration, are you growing 20%, 50%? What is your business doing? I don't care if it's for profit or not for profit. If you said you're going to help the homeless, all right, how many homeless people did you help this year? Are you growing at 100%, 200%? What's your growth rates? And they'll use a lot of those measurables and applying them to the not-for-profit world.
Right.
So I'll go to Rick, and the question here for you is, what are the basic types of entrepreneurs that you see out there?
That's a good question, because they're actually represented on the panel pretty nicely. To sum it up, number one, I would just say, just to roll on your last point, I think that, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, what you're seeing is a move for social good towards B Corps and sort of for-profit social benefit companies. I personally think that nonprofits will be phased out in the next 15, 20 years. But that's just me.
It's impact investing. So
it's impact investing.
The biggest thing, on the for-profit world is impact. How can I make money by doing good?
That's right.
Yeah.
Doing well by doing good. But that being said, so I think that when you're looking for money, and I say this from hard experience as well, good times and bad times, is that there are three sort of types of entrepreneur. And those skill sets do overlap. So take that, with the understanding that it's like a Venn diagram. It's, they're just three basic types, but you can do two or three of any of those. And they're really represented right in a row, right here. There's the pirate, the bootstrapper, who has passion, goes out in the high seas, grabs a team, and jumps out there, and just is like plundering along the way as she goes along. Like the famous quote says, an entrepreneur. That kind of entrepreneur is the kind who jumps out of a window and builds a plane on the way down, right? So then you have the samurai in the middle here, Ray, who's a good buddy of mine, so he's never heard me say this about him before. But the same like Bloomberg. You have a person who's done corporate work. They see a niche, they see a hole in the market because they've had to work it and they've had to work around that hole their entire corporate existence. And they say, you know what? I'm going to go fix that hole. I know there's money in that particular thing. So they actually go out and they build a company. Bloomberg did the exact same thing. That's how he became a billionaire. He worked on Wall Street, and he saw there was a problem with information, so he built information terminals. And then you have institutional, sort of the clerk, if you will. Not that you're personally a clerk, but the type, and that's just straight accounting. You look at any business and say, this business throws off cash. Yes or no? Does it throw off cash? And look at the balance sheet. If it does, you go for it. And if it doesn't, you don't. It's that really that cut and dried. So there are three types of ways to look at that. And you really have to know yourself before you can approach money, because the kind of entrepreneur you are drives the kind of product that you're credible in, because it all comes down to team at the end of the day. So if you're credible in your position and you have a good team and you know what kind of entrepreneur you are, you will, by definition, place yourself in front of the right type of investors. And that's just as important as knowing who you are, as knowing who you're talking to. And, do they make those kind of investments or not? So that I think is the basic sort of types of entrepreneurs that are out there right now.
So I have a question for the group, and this is anybody can take it. How's your experience been working with angel groups? And if you want to expand more about angel groups, I'm not sure how many people were what angel groups are, or their role in this entire space. And probably Ray, you'll probably be able to answer that one a little better. But go ahead.
So be cautious of the angel. I happen to know some angels. My view on angel investment, it'll work for some, but generally, what I find, and I think I don't have any research to back this, but I think from experience I can say for sure that people who call themselves angel investors tend to look for people that look like them.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So I think everyone on the panel, I'm curious to hear what other people's experiences are. So frankly, I've never gotten angel investment, and it's something I wouldn't do because I'd rather invest in my own businesses than invest in somebody else's. I would like to team up with younger people, potentially, and partner with them so that you have the experience with the youthful energy and new ideas and stuff like that. So for anyone who's a young person thinking that they're going to appeal to angel investors, I think it's a really tough road, right? If you can team up with someone that looks like the population of people who are angel investors, your odds increase a bit, which is what I've done when I've raised money for my companies, including my most recent company. The people who are investing on it look like my partner, look like me. So it's just the reality of kind of the way the world works, right?
But it's a personal angel investing by definition is a personal investment. It's a person giving you startup capital, to sort of seed and bring you to the stage where you can actually, be in a position to grow and get a series or whatever. So it's you're absolutely correct. But I would also say that if you look at other groups and say the Korean Americans who come over here and pool capital, that's their angel round. That's how they create an angel round and don't have to worry necessarily about going into the mainstream. So there's a lesson to be learned in that as well.
Well,
I mean, but you described the 10,000.
well, your first event, right? That was your
Right,
angel.
right, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so
She already
I'll try to
described the experience.
when Corey was talking about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I was thinking about how, there's billions of dollars at that foundation, and somebody like I would never go to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation at the stage that I'm at. So where I think when you're looking from a nonprofit's perspective and you're bootstrapping your nonprofit, you're going to go to much smaller foundations that are giving much smaller grants and I guess that's sort of comparable to the angel round in a for-profit environment. So you sort of have to pace yourself and identify the foundations that are giving smaller grants. And what I mean by that are $5,000, $10,000, not $5 million, $10 million. You're not going to go to a very, very large foundation on your first round. You're going to go to the smaller ones. You're going to bootstrap it. You're going to get some results, and then you're going to move on. And the mid-size foundations will start to look at you once you start getting some results, and then you'll just get momentum that way. So that's kind of how it works in the nonprofit sector. Question.
Oh, May has a question.
Oh,
Hi, I
Yeah.
have a quick question.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you did initially to be effective on an extremely small budget for a nonprofit in particular? But I'm sure social media came into play in that sense, but what are some of the other things strategically that you prioritize? It's hard to start.
Yeah, it's really hard to start. I mean, so when I talked about being efficient at the beginning, the first thing I didn't take a salary. I was really kind of just doing it as out of my own blood, sweat, and tears, and love for what I was doing. And as we started, obviously, it doesn't go very far when you're trying to get groceries and food and whatever. So you've got to start once in the first $10,000. We still don't have an office. So some of those traditional things that you get set up now with all the co-working spaces, there's so many ways that you could forego some of those large sort of overhead expenses before you get started. And so right now we're meeting in coffee shops. We're meeting in sometimes in a co-working space if we have to have a big group meeting. I had 2 colleagues of mine who took radical cuts in their salary to get started because they believed in what we were doing. And now I'm able to pay them a little bit more. It's certainly not competitive yet, but we'll get there. But I think it's really just being very, all the money that we got went right into our program, went right into our mission, and everything else was marginal. And we really tried to, of course, we're putting in some of our own money because we're copying and we're doing all those kinds of, taxi rides or whatever. We're not charging the organization for any of that stuff. So a little bit of it is your own blood, sweat, and tears, and then really taking the money that you have and putting it right to the program to get the results so that you can start to get the momentum.
and one of the biggest things from a foundation, when they look at your company to donate, they look at how you're spending your money. If I'm going to give you $10,000, I want 10% or 5% of that to go to, overhead and management, but I want 90 to 95% of that to go to the programs that you say you're going to run. And when you look at a foundation where 50% goes to overhead, a lot of times you'll see foundations walk away because they don't want to put their money into a not-for-profit that's about supporting someone's lifestyle. They want to make a difference. And so you have to look at your financials on, am I putting 80% to programs, 90% to programs, or am I putting 50% to programs? Because those are going to be the factors that they're going to look at when they decide whether they cut you a check or not.
Very competitive.
It's very.
As a bank, as someone who's a banker who's been on the other side determining where grants go to which nonprofits, it's becoming increasingly more competitive. There were a point in time 20 years ago, the same 5 nonprofits got money from the bank every year. Then, we had 5 more that came on board and said, well, listen, we're doing this. So we have folks now that really analyze the impact of what our dollars are doing in the community. So it's as competitive as the for-profit industry is now.
I want to talk about something something Barbara said. So this is going to sound kind of odd, So I grew up in technically poverty, situations, right? Here in New York City, not far from here, and it took me, I guess 35 years to end up in the same situation. What's the difference? The difference is that when I was growing up, I had a financial poverty, but I was very rich socially, right? Because I was in a loving climate, huge community, extended family, a lot of support, right? 35 years later, I voluntarily put myself in poverty, right? But I have a lot of financial assets now, a lot of social assets, right? So the business I just started, I take no salary. Everything gets reinvested. So for the last 2 years, I've had no income, right? How I live, obviously, is very different than how I lived, 35 years ago. But it's kind of like, even though, Barbara described her situation as a nonprofit, well, I'm running a for-profit business. I'm doing my current business to make a lot of money, but I'm taking no salary. Everything goes back into the business, right? So even after all the experience that I've had with several businesses, to start, still, it's like, what am I willing to sacrifice, right? To make it real.
The next question is actually on the institution side. So what can a business do to properly position itself to become bankable as quickly as possible? Because obviously there's a time before the organization is ready to go to a bank. So what's that timing like? What do they need to do to accelerate that process if they don't want to raise equity because they don't feel like giving away parts of their company? And they feel like, look, I'll pay an interest note and I'll keep more equity for myself and my shareholders.
So I just want to back up a little bit. Who here remembers 2008 and what happened with banks? Right? It wasn't a lot of fun to be a banker. And as a result, banks are now probably as heavily regulated as the healthcare industry. We have auditors that come in annually, sometimes twice a year, depending on which agency governs us. So banks have become exceedingly risk averse at this point. It's difficult now to get a loan. There was a point in time where if you had a bank and you knew the branch manager and you had a little store in the corner and he saw that you had an operation and you kept your account at the bank, you could walk in there and get a loan with a handshake. Clearly that's changed. Some of that is what caused the problems in 2008 on a much larger scale. There were folks at the top of the bank shaking hands and giving out millions of dollars. So now what we look for as banks is for folks to kind of put their business together, to operate with sound financial procedures. Hire a bookkeeper, get QuickBooks. It's very easy now to check your records financially. Carver, having been around 65 years, believe it or not, just made it to the digital age. It took us till this year to get a mobile app, a robust online platform. So we look for a business to have a business plan. Number one, when you come in, be able to be passionate, as the folks up here have said about your business. When you walk into a bank to apply for a loan and establish a relationship, we look for passion. I know I do. I put a couple $100 million on the street in small business lending, and I like to see the passion. I like to see the vision that the entrepreneur has behind it, and I've seldom been wrong when they have that passion. Another thing we look for is the relationships that you have. Do you have a good attorney? Have you structured yourself as a business properly? Do you have an accountant? Are these folks helping to keep you out of jail and out of the eyes of the IRS? What's your business plan for growth? Is your business dynamic? So we look for all those things, but primarily it's an individual situation. Each loan is different. Every day I see people that want loans, and they're all different. Although to the same degree they're all the same. They want financing to help grow their business or get them through a tough time or acquire another business, or take their business to much higher levels.
Can I just comment on that, just on the opposite end of the spectrum? Because there are two things, coming from your comments, and they're both very, very true. One being, don't go to a bank unless you have receivables, and you have a strong balance sheet. And two, come to the bank and we'll help you out. But that is entirely what banks say. So that it's a shameless plug at this point, because Mint Combine, which is my company, which is just over a year old, is focused on bypassing traditional forms of revenue and creating your own currency. There, with things like Bitcoin and over 550 different digital currencies, the question of value is being questioned all over the world. What creates value? What is community value? What is the value of your business? Nonprofits especially can benefit from this. So, with all due respect to banks, and some of my best friends are bankers, I don't mean to say that in a negative way, it's true. The way that you fund startups now and in the future is going to be radically different from what you've seen and what our fathers and grandfathers saw. You actually, in a community, can create your own set of value. You can cash your value in on exchanges a little bit further down the road, maybe a year or two, and you can build your own business and create your own currency. Before the Civil War, there were over 10,000 currencies in the U.S., and that time is coming again. So, I mean, literally, right, there's already 550. Most of them aren't worth anything, but they don't have any community behind them. There's a community here of people in this building right now that if they decided there was value in, say, a Harlem coin, a digital asset, there would, by definition, be value. You just have to find ways to spend it and people to accept it, et cetera. That's what we specialize in, and Ray actually is very instrumental in our talks and what we're doing now, so we know each other. But I urge anybody here looking for funding not to be limited to the traditional rails that we've become used to. I think that you need to look out into the greater technology sector and find out how people are using digital currencies. Explore Bitcoin, explore altcoins, and work it out. And if you don't want to talk about something, then call me, because that's what we do.
We have some time for some questions. Actually, we kind of ran through the panel pretty quickly. So if anyone has any questions, by all means, just raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you.
Easy question. Your thoughts about the status, if any, of crowdfunding, both contribution-based platforms and also the possibility of equity crowdfunding.
It's interesting you asked that. I've got a buddy who just initiated his crowdfunding program yesterday. Had a restaurant in Brooklyn and was doing well, had a dispute with the landlord and moved out, and there's a tremendous need. You talked about the marketplace creating the value for your business, to be the folks that invest. Mm-hmm. So, there was a lot of outcry about the business closing. He put his crowdfunding program into effect yesterday. I think he's looking to raise $75,000 or somewhere in that range. I didn't check it yet, but as of yesterday, he had raised $5,000 in a day in the first few hours when I looked on. I think it's a great alternative. I think that it's a competitive environment for businesses, and banks are just one piece of the options that you should have out there. When folks come into at Carver, we're a community bank, so if you come in and we can't identify a way to make a loan, we'll direct you to someone who's a non-traditional lender who could probably provide you with a micro loan or maybe some non-traditional lending that can help get you to a bank. So we're kind of the last step, on the stairway that leads up to a successful business. But crowdfunding is definitely a viable option. I've seen it be extremely successful. So I think it's part of the future of where we're going.
I mean, two things on that. I don't want to hijack the whole thing, but just two things on that. I just happen to know a lot about crowdfunding. The first thing is, if you want to know the correct way to do a crowdfunding campaign, go to Rocket Hub, which is run by a guy named Brian Meese. At Rocket Hub, you'll see a tutorial. We'll teach you everything you need to know: how to make your video, how long it should be, etc. Everything about a successful crowd raise. The second thing is be careful. There's a backlash coming in the crowdfunding sector. To answer your question, part B to that, because there's no equity exchanged, people wonder, you get a T-shirt or you get something. You really have to be prepared to give people something back for their money. The days of giving $5 or $10 and no return for the investor, which is what they basically are, those days are coming to an end, actually, even in the nonprofit world. You really have to give something tangible back to people for that to be. Pebble started that. They raised millions of dollars, and people got their watches late, and sometimes a year late, and got no stock. They got no carry-on. So they're wondering why do this? Why invest in this? So that's passion-driven. You can do it that way. I think your friend probably has a passion-driven project. But if it's about, if you have something that needs capital and you have a product that is not as passionate as that, then you have to be careful what you give back to people and think about it very, very extensively.
Can I talk about it? Yeah. So the crowdfunding term, I want to answer you had a multi-part question. So crowdfunding is sort of an overloaded term, right? So sort of pulling apart your question. The Jobs Act still hasn't resolved itself, right? So equity funding still is in a state of flux and has some issues with it from a regulatory perspective, also relating back to cryptocurrencies and those sorts of things. So I would hold on that. Other than the sweeping wild example of the secondary markets with Facebook, which kind of manipulated the market before going to the IPO. Finance people understand that all the intricacies and nuances of that. But generally when people talk about crowdfunding, they're referring to the donation-based and reward-based. And there's two aspects of that. One is to actually raise the funds to build a product. The more interesting and more important is to actually get customers and sell product and test the market, right? So the benefit of the crowdfunding platforms is primarily for getting market validation. So let me give you a couple of examples. My youngest brother did an independent film. He finished the film. The only thing that he needed was the music licensing. He has a huge following. He lives here in Harlem. He has a huge following on Facebook and social media. He's a personality that's sort of known in the industry. So when he did his crowdfunding, in 4 weeks, he raised all the money with no problem, right? So he basically tapped into the social capital that he already had. So a lot of kids putting up $5 and they raised, all the money you need to put out his independent, work of art, right? So he was basically cashing in on the social capital that he had already accumulated over many, many years, right? The second thing I want to sort of point out about crowdfunding, there's a gentleman in the back named Dwight Peters, who has a very interesting story to tell. Unfortunately, he's not on this panel, but you should definitely attend his session when he speaks. And Dwight what I learned from Dwight is that in crowdfunding, there are actually people who are super funders who in effect are acting like angels. But they're almost in a philanthropic, they recognize the role of the angel, which is angel investors don't actually ever make money. Some of them do. It's very rare, but you're in the charity business. But they don't want to be in the charity business, right? So it's kind of an odd situation. There's this group of people who are doing the crowdfunding, and they're super funders. And Dwight created a business. We actually captures all the super funders. And he's able to communicate. So he actually knows thousands of super funders, right? That happens to be a very small population of people on the crowdfunding platform, right? Now that can trigger the issue that Rick pointed out, which is some of those super funders, like the Oculus that happened recently, right? People have funded Oculus, and then they went out and I think they, sold or whatever. And those guys made a lot of money in a very short period of time. Were their backers who were doing it from a donation standpoint didn't participate at all, right? So now there's a bit of a backlash as a result of that. So it's very nuanced. I mean, I think it's an interesting development. There's still a lot of problems to solve there, certainly from the Jobs Act and the equity perspective. I think there's a lot to learn, and I think there are people who are figuring it out, and you have to tap into the ones that have sort of figured out the tricks and the nuances.
Ray, you jumped over Oculus Rift, though, and I just want to, that's a really good example you brought up. I don't know if other people really know what's going on. Yeah, but the Oculus Rift is basically a augmented reality helmet that this group was making. They only had a prototype. They actually didn't have a real product. They crowdfunded a lot of money to get to past the prototype phase to create an actual product. They only had one or two or something like that. It was a ridiculously low number of them. And then they were bought by Facebook for $2 billion. And the investors who got them to the point of having a product got zero.
So that's the crowdfunding. That's the catch on crowdfunding.
That's
is
the
that you
catch
don't
on
get
crowdfunding.
equity
So before
in
the
that.
investors could even get, say, first dibs on
Right.
a unit, they actually were out of the picture. It's completely gone. So it makes it, and that was a big thing in the crowdfunding
Yeah,
space.
so who's actually gaining from the crowdfunding?
I
Yeah.
guess the question was, and this speaks to your point, there is that distinction between donation-based funding of projects, which happen to be passion projects, and which those super funders will fund without necessarily any real expectation that they'll receive any participation in the profits of the company should they come. The interesting prospect in the future is to the extent to which regulations prompted by the Job Act will allow for equity crowdfunding, and I was just wondering whether
Yeah, okay. So let-
Maybe.
So let me comment. So I see you're into, and you obviously you must have a background in finance. So let me respond specifically to the Job Act and my opinion on the equity crowdfunding. I think, with all the promise, I think it's really dangerous. I think it has some really unintended consequences that are really very negative. The reason is because most investment at such an early stage is done by people who can see each other, press to flush.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you described it, right? Yeah. And when you remove that and you create this kind of virtual zone, and you're funding companies for which you have entrepreneurs who are not vetted, because there's no certification process for an entrepreneur, right? So it's this notion. It's this bizarre situation where the solution, after the financial crisis, there was a lot of regulation put on sort of the banks, but then there's the deregulation moved somewhere else. So now you don't have to be an accredited investor. Anyone can go and spend their money on some crazy notion on an entrepreneur for which they can't do any due diligence. Now, the idea is that, well, you spread the risk amongst, thousands of people so the damage is kind of limited. Right? But the amount of potential fraud, I mean, anyone who's in finance knows about the, OTC, and what happens there, right? And how much security fraud happens, right? I work in international markets, so, I see crazy situations with stock, with people out of Thailand setting up companies in Holland and then go, try to trade on the OTC. I mean, the security fraud, there are people out there who are really brilliant, who are masters at milking money, right? And I think the crowdfunding stuff has a risk. And that's part of the reason why I think the Jobs Act has stalled. I think there is a way to do it, but I think you have to actually get beyond sort of the qualified accredited investor with the fairly low bar that's put on it. A lot of people in New York kind of satisfy that bar. And then I think there has to be requirements or some means test put on the entrepreneurs in the same way that the banks do it, right? So that if you go on an equity play crowdfunding, that you've got a carver to say, we're not ready to give them debt, but I think they're ready to get equity, and we'll put them on a watch list. And we've done the diligence, and they do own their home, and they, it's a real business, and those sorts of things. I think there's a role to play for the institutions. The free-for-all that is being proposed in Congress, I think, could be potentially disastrous.
I think you got to do a level of diligence on your own side. It's got to be a level of responsibility.
But there's no transparency. Even if there was diligence, there's no transparency requirement on the entrepreneur.
No, there isn't, and that's why, if I put money out, I'm going to knock on the door.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's right. Each individual investor has to have some accountability for the dollars they put out. Right? You can't say, "Oh, I put out $10,000 and I don't know." Well, you didn't ask the question. So are there any other? Terry.
I have one more crowdfunding question. So there is a way now of running your own crowdfunding site with an advanced sales campaign if you have a following. And so I want to know your thoughts. We're considering doing that for a book project on someone who has a following versus going to a Kickstarter. I want to know your thoughts.
That's the social capital Ray was talking about.
Yeah,
Terry.
I would
you can
absolutely-
actually bank on that. Sure.
Yeah, there's a young woman, Stephanie Lampkin, who will be on the same panel as Dwight, and this is what she did. She basically went and just put up her own site. You know, she called up a bunch of people and she raised $30,000, within a couple of weeks, right? And I got a call from her too, right? So I was happy to help her out as much as I could. But yeah, I mean, she didn't want to pay the 10 or 15% that you have, the penalty that you have to pay on the crowdfunding. So, in a sense, the crowdfunding I think was a good first model, but then I think there's a wave. If the person has a following for a book, that's where most of the money is going to come from. I'm not sure they should incur the cost of capital, or especially if it's not a lot of money. So I would encourage you to sort of roll your own.
One last question.
Different topic. I just was wondering if each of you could mention a book or a place of inspirational source, like an author or a mentor, a resource. A book, again, or something that you read that's on your book, your bedstand, or something that's really inspired you.
Something inspirational that you've read that inspired you.
Oh, well,
Generally?
go ahead.
The entire
Just
group.
in-
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a book called Why Should White Guys Have All the Fun? A lot of folks, like Reginald Lewis, would say, read it when it first came out. It was inspirational for me, absolutely.
That was a good book.
Go ahead.
For me, from the context of where I'm working, Malcolm Gladwell's David and Goliath was a great book. Was a great book. In particular, his talk about how, if you're at the bottom of the class at Harvard, you're actually prone to be less successful than if you're at the top of the class at some state university. I just found that really fascinating, inspirational.
I mean, I've read a lot of books. That one, and there's a whole bunch of other one too, which was great. Read Reggie Lewis. But the first book I ever read that brought me down that path was called The Book of Five Rings, and it's a treatise from a 16th century Japanese samurai, and his name is Miyamoto Musashi. And so, if you ever pick that up, just you'll see when you read it how it pertains to what's happening today.
So there's two books I would recommend. One is a fairly old book called Voluntary Simplicity. I read it maybe 25 years ago and it had a big influence on me. And the second book is Banker to the Poor, which was written by Dr. Muhammad Yunus, which really inspired me to pursue. I have several businesses, but one of the businesses targeted to the developing world is that's a book that kind of triggered my current inspiration.
I think we're done on time. For me, David and Goliath is the latest Malcolm Gladwell book. I thought it was pretty great. Thank you all for your time. Obviously, the panelists will be here after, and you can talk to them and find out more. Appreciate everyone coming. Hopefully, you've learned something, and there's been some nuggets that you can take away. And we look forward to you guys progressing in the future. Thank you.